So my job today is to do something I've never done before, which is to talk about the labor history of PEI. And this is going to be a wave-top look because I know a lot about the history of the island, but I don't say that I'm an expert on the labor history. So we're going to be looking just at the wave tops. And of course, most of the good things, as you know, most of the good things at a union level happen without having to go out on the street. But of course, the things that stick in history are the conflicts. So I'm ignoring all the good things we do by talking to one another, and we'll be talking about stuff that went wrong. So 45 minutes is the objective. So you can put me on the timer now. All right, so before we start, a couple of small points. The island is not known for labor history in Canada, but we've had a couple of islanders who did some unusual things, although not on PEI. Cy Ching, labor negotiator and mediator for FDR and Harry Truman from Surrey. Not Surrey, BC. The real Surrey, the one up east of PEI. And Malcolm Bruce, from my neck of the woods in PEI, co-founder of the Communist Party of China. Oh, sorry, Canada, not China. Malcolm Bruce. He was a Trotskyite, apparently, to his dying day. But he lived mostly in BC at the later part of his life. He looks like he is actually the coach of the Blackhawks or something from the 1960s. So here's a bird's eye view map of the capital, where you are now, from 1878. And look at all the smoke. Where there's smoke, there should be industry, right? No. One of the hallmarks of labor history on PEI is that we did not succeed in actually industrializing. And so the foundation of a lot of unions to protect workers in industry is kind of absent on PEI. So I'm going to start by talking about the labor movement in our major industries. Agriculture being number one. Fewer people farm now than ever before. The actual number of people who seriously farm is probably down to about 700 or 800 farms. In 1900, there were 14,000 farms on PEI. And well over 3/4 of islanders lived in the country. And this is just an excuse to show you some nice slides of the island 100 years ago. I did put in hay loose like that when I was a kid with our neighbor. Sweet contentment? No, not really. But when island farmers organized, they tended to organize in federations and institutes rather than in unions, although there are some exceptions, and we're going to get to those. So I'm going to follow the topic here in like a chronological way, and then we're going to jump back in time to look at other industries. By the late 1800s, if you know anything about the history of our province, we blamed it on joining Canada, but our economy kind of tanked after 1873. It stagnated. In truth, because our resource base was limited and the population kept rising, and so the pie kept having to be cut smaller and smaller, and people were finding it hard to make a living, and farmers were finding it hard to sell their crops and livestock in markets off island because we're small and the scale actually matters quite a bit. So one of the first radical farm organizations in Canada, the Patrons of Industry, sounds like it is some kind of industrial union, but it's actually a rural organization, started organizing on PEI in the mid-1890s. They sent in a guy from Ontario. So anyone here from Ontario, by the way? Anyone here from Toronto? Usually we slag off Toronto and get away with it. Okay. I like the big smoke. The big smoke is good. The big smoke is good. Anyway, they send in an organizer from Ontario, and he did great. Look at all the locals or lodges that he organized in PEI. He even founded a newspaper. In fact, get everything he wanted except the one thing that the patrons of industry most needed, and that was votes. When came election time, Islanders were not willing to vote for the patrons of industry, even though they were in favor of things like giving women the vote and doing things for farmers and improving the efficiency of their government and doing away with corruption and stuff that nobody cares about, apparently. Now, this isn't a great photograph. I just had to use it because they're mooning us. The Federation of Agriculture. So there are farmers' institutes and societies. But in 1941, the Federation of Agriculture, got established, and it was a branch of, there's a national sort of kind of organization. But the Federation of Agriculture doesn't really function like a union. In fact, by the 1960s, their critics are saying that they're just a puppet of the government. They too often work with the government, with the private sector, and in some instances you have to work against. And by the 1960s, that was mattering quite a bit because agriculture and PEI was in free fall. I mentioned that in 1941 there were 14,000 farms. I'll give you a slide in a second showing you the decline in numbers. There's still 12,000 farms in 1941, and after that the number dropped like a rock because the experts said you have to get larger, get machinery, and go into monoculture. So go big or stay home. Well, Islanders began to stay home, including my own farm. We stopped farming in 1968. Look at the far right-hand side. This is farm income per head as a proportion of the personal income of Canadians. 15%. 1971, when things came to a head, 7% of the national average. Island farmers were poor, and they felt the government should be doing something about it. And island farmers were getting out of business. The size of farms was going up, and the mechanization was going up. The concentration on the potato was going up, but the number of farms and farmers was going down. There'll be a test, by the way, on the stats. So I hope you're taking notes so that we can, at the end, we can come back. So in 1969, if you're an Islander, you've been talked to death about the development plan, as it was known, the CDP. It was a massive government attempt, the provincial government in partnership with Ottawa provided most of the money, to completely transform the island's economy and society. And that meant doing a lot of things about agriculture, except that they forgot to talk to one sector of the economy, which was the farmers. So 15-year plan, 3 5-year plans, sounds like Russia in the 1920s, $725 million in 1969 dollars. Yes, wow. But they weren't consulting with farmers, and farm incomes were tanking, and farmers were getting fed up with this Federation of Agriculture. And out west, a radical new farm organization got formed called the National Farmers Union. And island farmers, the militant ones, embraced it. And they formed in 1969, but in 1971, they took militant action. And I wish I could show you photographs of what they did on our roads, but the photographs were reproduced in The Guardian on microfilm, and the quality was so bad, even I couldn't show them to you in conscience. But when they called for a meeting with the Premier, and the Premier refused to meet with them, refused their ultimatum, sound familiar to union people? They took to the roads with their tractors and clogged up traffic, particularly on roads leading into the city, and climaxing in a blockade of the ferry terminal at Borden. In August of 1971, at the height of the tourism season, and tourism was the new darling of the planners, And farmers were feeling envious and left out. That, oh, it was all tourism. Tourism's going to be the new number one industry. Well, take that, tourists. They also blockaded entry to the Gold Cup and saucer race. Didn't go over well. They had to back off. Blockading the tourists, Islanders had no problem with. Well, we had a bit of a problem with because a lot of people were involved in the tourism industry. But the premier still refused to, actually meet with them. They went as far as they could go. A bunch of people got arrested. And then once things had calmed down, the premier met with them. And the government changed their policies to aid small farmers. So they succeeded. They just couldn't be seen to succeed. So 1971 takes me up to the present. So I'm going to skip over now. I'm going to back up to something else because, my father was a fisherman as well as a farmer. He was a carpenter too. In Atlantic Canada, where people involved in the fishery were traditionally among the most exploited, you would have thought there would be a militant union movement. But the problem on PEI for fishers is that they don't think of themselves as a worker class. They don't think of themselves as union people. They think of themselves as independent producers who will band together until they disagree with one another, in which case their unions usually fall apart. And on PEI, that was particularly true because most people who fished on PEI were like my father. They were people that had farms, who farmed and they fished for lobsters in the spring to supplement their income. And they fished for a bit of herring and mackerel to catch their bait, to support their lobster fishing, but they didn't fish full time like in Newfoundland. So the union movement in the fishing industry, the number 2 industry on PEI until the tourism industry got larger, saw the exploitation of fishers, particularly by the packers, particularly in the western end of PEI, where the packers owned the local store and sold the supplies to the fishermen and bought their catch, and so set the price on the things they sold to the fishermen on credit, but then also set the price on the product that they bought. And surprise, surprise, the packers always came out making a profit, but the fishermen often didn't. The fishery, as I said, was mostly involved with lobster canning. Today, canning is a minor part of the industry, but for a century, canning was the backbone of the industry. We couldn't sell our lobster, live or fresh because we were too far away from the major markets. Our lobster would die. But the first official union was formed in Tignish in 1925. But it didn't really function like a union. It was organized by a local lad who had become a lawyer, and he was eccentric and egotistical, but he did care for the fishers. It organized more like a co-op. And in fact, it is a forerunner of the cooperative movement more than a forerunner of a labor movement in fishing, in Tignish, which is the far western end of PEI. Now, McCarthy, who was the guy who founded that union, he did encourage the formation of unions. And as you can see, during the Depression, a lot of them were formed. But they had difficulty acting together, and most of the unions had a short life. Today, there is a fishermen's association, and I think the wording is significant, that it's not called a union, it's called and they are fractious. They tend not to pull together the way that you would expect. But maybe that's not so unusual, because if you're a part of a union, as I have been, you feel the need to be able to argue with the people that you work with, as well as with your employer. Anyway, fishers and farmers, when they formed communal organizations, tended to turn to the cooperative movement, especially in the 30s during the years of the Depression. There was a new wave of cooperative movement that started in Nova Scotia, Antigonish movement it's called, famous around the world, spread to PEI, and we formed all kinds of cooperative stores and factories for lobster canning and credit unions, so that people who needed small loans could get loans from banks, which otherwise wouldn't give you the time of day. So organized mostly by Catholic lay people and clergy, it was particularly strong in Catholic areas, but it was not a denominational movement at all. Co-op stores, among the ones, I'm a member of a co-op store, 2994. So how are we doing for time? We're 20, we're 50. Okay, we're now going to move to what most of us would recognize. So I'm skipping the tourism industry. It is never organized as a labor movement, although it has thousands of employees on like a seasonal basis. And those are the three major industries in PEI. And I'm going to talk about blue-collar unions and white-collar unions. This is a mural on Summerside, I think on the library in Summerside. So here is the president of the Board of Trade talking in 1920 about PEI. Saying, well, we're not a land of millionaires, but there's no real poverty on PEI. I would take issue with that. Free from communism, which was a fear going around the world, a Red Scare at that time. Strikes, strife, poverty. In comparative terms, that may have been true. As you're about to see, there's more to the story than that. The first ever union formed on PEI was on the PEI Railway, which was the largest employer on PEI. It was a government-owned, road. And the first ever union was apparently 1898 or 99, depending on the source that you read. Eventually, there were a number of unions on the railway, depending on what you did, but eventually one major union on the railway. But the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada and the AFL in the United States both started organizing on PEI in 1901, and there was a proliferation of unions. I think there were up to 16 at one time, most of them lasting only a few years. There's a couple of stats. 5 labor disputes in 20 years. So I worked at the university for 20 years and was on strike twice, just myself. But, however, blue-collar unions, the railway was important to PEI. It never turned a profit in 116 years of operation. Consistently lost money, but it did what islanders needed it to do. And so when the railway didn't run, it was bad for shippers and it was bad for people. But after 1919, the ferry service was part of Canadian National Railways. And so every time there was a national railway strike, not only did the trains not run on PEI, the ferry didn't run on PEI. And that was bad. Bad for islanders, bad for shippers, bad for tourists. And government, if you wanted to get their knickers in a knot, just have a railway strike. And there were a number of them on PEI, 1950, 1966, 1973, and 1987, although I think Marine Atlantic may have been kind of separated out. Mostly during the height of tourism season. Mostly meaning that the ferry at Wood Islands, which was privately owned and already had lineups that lasted 2 to 4 hours, suddenly became someplace that you camped rather than someplace you left the island from. So we could do song and dance about this, but governments were always threatening to intervene whenever there was a railway strike because the ferry service was so important as our lifeline to the outside world. These actually are still there at Cavendish, the cottages at Cavendish. So railway unions, an important part of labor history on PEI, but by and large, their impact confined to the work, the conditions of work, and it's a national union, not a local union. And every now and then there's a strike, and islanders feel the pain of that strike. One of the recurring themes that I may forget to talk about later is that there is a perception throughout the history of the island that islanders are not sympathetic to unions. And it's because most islanders were not part of a union. Most islanders were involved in the fishery, in farming. And so they didn't understand them. They feared communism. They feared radicalism. It's another thing about living on a small island. On small islands, to get along, you have to get along. And so islanders tend more to fight behind people's backs than conflict out in the open was for a long time very much socially unacceptable. I'm reminded of a story. A friend of mine from up west in Tignish, he married an off-islander, a mainlander. I think she was a Newfoundlander. And somebody asked her, what's it like living up there, up west in Tignish? She said, it's the damnedest place, she said. First they stab you in the back, and then they hold a benefit for you. So that kind of sets the table for an attitude towards, unions and the labor movement. It's seen as somehow foreign and other, but also openly willing to have, disputes. And islanders have tended to avoid that. That being said, there were eventually all kinds of small unions, including longshoremen who loaded the goods at the wharves. And this is a bunch of them loading cargo of spuds, of potatoes in the 1920s. But that gave rise, the blue-collar union movement in PEI gave rise to a spectacular event in the union history of Canada. In 1947, there was a national strike of meat packers, and there was a meat packing plant in Charlottetown right alongside the bridge, which was why you always rolled your window up anytime you crossed the Hillsborough Bridge. That and the fact that the city emptied sewage directly into the harbor, which they used to do in Halifax. I'm sure they don't anymore. So in September 1947, there was a national strike. The local went on strike. 70 employees, they're asking for a raise of 32 cents an hour. Farmers wanting to get their cattle slaughtered. It's the fall after all. We're getting anxious. And the premier was Walter Jones, an eccentric individual known in history as the farmer premier. He was a farmer. Well-educated farmer, I should add. But he was a farmer, and he put farm interests first. He was fighting a retrograde action to protect agriculture from the modern world. So he offered the workers, the strikers, 50 cents a carcass if they would go back to work until the strike was over. The union local turned him down, and the government took over the plant and operated it with scab labor. And then when the national strike finally came to an end, he wouldn't give the plant back until the union agreed to allow the scab workers to continue to be employed there. They settled, by the way, for 7 cents instead of 32 cents. And the following year, the government of PEI passed an act giving Attorney General the discretion to give a license to any local union and outlawing any union with any off-island affiliation. That made us the laughingstock of Canada. No one had laughed at us that hard since we outlawed the automobile in 1908. In fact, there were legal challenges in the offing, and the government had to recant a year later. They repealed the act. But they effectively banned unions with outside affiliation. Walter Jones, one of the best loved premiers in island history, not his shining moment. Here's another strike that I had forgotten about, the Perfection Food Strike. 1985, 72 workers went on strike. The strike lasted 6 months, and at times it was, when strikes do go on, things get short, including your wages, your resources, and also your temper. They also had a problem with scab labor. And this caused or created labor history because the management decided that when the strike was over, it had no obligation to allow the strikers to return to their jobs. It would not guarantee them a job. In fact, it announced its intention to keep the scab labor that it had been using to keep the plant open. And of course, there was a lot of pressure on the Perfection Food Plant because it produces milk and ice cream produced by island farmers. And really the farmers on PEI up until then had been the tail that wagged the dog when it came to policy on PEI, despite what I just said about 1971. So this was a fundamental challenge to the rights of workers. Eventually, they were told, you can't do that. They had to abandon that. The strike eventually ended. The Perfection Foods management never recovered. I don't know whether it was because of the bad karma. I don't know whether it was because of losses incurred by not being fully in operation, or whether the management was just not up to it. But they went under in 1991 and were bought out by ADL, which is it started out as a cooperative, but now it's like essentially a big business. So if you want to buy milk out there in the store, you can still find the brand, but the firm does not actually exist anymore. This is something that the Cooper Institute said in 1986. They were a kind of social activist, research group. And this is saying essentially what I'm saying. The economic history, independent primary production, secondary industry has not grown rapidly. The union movement, not really something islanders thought a lot about or invested in. To be union on PEI is to go against the tide. That has changed. And it's changed in part because the union movement on PEI is now largely a white-collar movement. It's people like myself who work at a university. I used to work for the province of PEI. I was a provincial government employee. White-collar provides the bulk of members of unions on PEI. School teachers work for the government. And the teachers were one of the first unions. In 1919, they established a union in 1918 and threatened to go on strike. And the premier had to give in because there were jobs all over the country for teachers which paid 3 or 4 times as much as you could make as a teacher on PEI. So islanders were leaving to teach elsewhere. So they gave them a big raise. A decade later, they threatened to go on strike again, and the premier said, yeah, because there was a depression on and there were no jobs for anybody anyplace else in Canada. So the teachers had lost a sense of leverage. But here is an odd thing. In 1971, the government established a mechanism to bargain with its employees. And during the process of establishing those, the teachers' union threatened to go on strike unless they were given, the right not to strike. They wanted compulsory arbitration, or they would go on strike to get it. I wrote that in 2000 in a book that I wrote on the history of the island, and I looked at it again and I said, well, that just can't be right. So I spent an hour at the library yesterday confirming that, in fact, they demanded the right not to strike. Because they assumed that the public wouldn't support the teachers if they went on strike. They would do better at compulsory arbitration than they would if they walked out. What can I say? PEI. A few random milestones because I need to get to the end here. Workers' compensation, Trades and Labor Council, minimum wage legislation established, first for women, then for men, interestingly, a year apart. The Confederation of Labor, which I've skipped entirely, still in existence. That's right, oopsie, signing a contract with the province. In 1982, the province canceled a wage increase for UPSI, and they went on the street, and the government, backed off. In 1994, by which time I was working for the province, they did it again. They signed a contract, and 6 months later, they said, we're financially in big trouble. We're cutting your wages by 7.5%. But this time they got away with it, but not before we actually increased our union dues so that we could fight it. So I had my wages cut and my union dues went up. But anyway, I'm not bitter. Civil service, this just shows you, I think the numbers are suspect, but they show you the incredible growth of government, which means the growth of white-collar union memberships. More of the same, I updated it, but I said, I don't know how they define their numbers, because it looks like there were fewer people working for the government now, and I just know that's not true. And anyway, this is the demonstration of which I was a part. I'm standing right here, talking to a friend I met from high school that I hadn't seen in 20 years. And we threw eggs at the premier, and we demonstrated, and the premier had to have a getaway car because we raided the legislature during the session. And anyway, it was all pretty exciting, and, well, our wages got cut by 7.5%. And now here's one that I felt keenly. That's right, I'm a plasma donor since 1997. And I know the success of that organization and PEI is entirely due to the quality of the staff. And their working conditions weren't that great. And they went out on strike, and they were on strike for nearly a year. And I can remember writing to their national, I don't know what's called, the president or anyway, telling them that they were missing the boat, and that these people deserved more hours, and they deserved all kinds of benefits that they weren't getting. Anyway, I won't say that you won, but you didn't lose either. And so I promised that I would include a slide of them. And when your union, like that is such a small local, for them to be on the picket line for a year is an enormous sacrifice. Enormous sacrifice. Because you can't just say, well, I only have to be once a week on the picket line. If you want to have a picket line, pretty much every day, someone from about 9 people has to be there. Anyway, and finally, I'm not going to say solidarity. I'm a white-collar union member, which means, do I really understand unions? Maybe, maybe not. But I, too, have been on strike twice in my career at UPEI. Every time I see this sign, though, I cringe a little. We are UPEI. Well, the professors are not UPEI. There are other unions on campus, staff members, without which the university could not operate. They, too, are UPEI, and essentially, none of us would have a job if it weren't for students. The students are UPEI. However, so I didn't choose that sign when I walked the picket line, and I fell out with union leadership, and they don't say hello to me. But I walked, they don't. I met one on campus the other day, and she just turned the other way because someone heard me say we were holding the students hostage. Because we had to, because that's the only way that the strike was going to work. But apparently that didn't go over well. But this isn't about me. It's simply to say that Islanders now have a different concept of unions. With the growth of white-collar unions, that means all unions are more respected and recognized, and we see the value of them, which is why we're glad to have you here. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Professor MacDonald?
Just easy ones. Yes,
Dawn?
Sorry, I didn't understand. Why wouldn't the government negotiate with the farmers?
because they refused to kowtow to ultimatums. They felt that the farmers were giving them ultimatums. They wanted a series of small concessions. We want marked gas for our tractors. Well, we're not going to meet with you to talk about that. So because there was a kind of a perception that the farmers were giving ultimatums, then the government felt it was setting a bad example if they were seen to cave. Anyway.
I love that they took to the streets.
But yeah, and also, actually, the minister was willing to meet with them. But they said, no, we want to meet with the cabinet. We want to have a discussion, a frank discussion with the cabinet about our issues. That's all that they were asking for. And eventually, that's what they got. But it's like, I was going to make an analogy to a child and a parent, but that casts us in the wrong light as union people. But yeah, it was a bad move on their part, but they weren't used to farmers being militant. They just weren't used to farmers being militant. And so they called their bluff. As farmers, they called their bluff. And, well, they got everybody's attention. If you've ever been behind a tractor on an island road, cursing and swearing while you're saying, why are there no passing lanes in PEI? You can understand the frustration that a tractor demonstration will cause. Yes?
Yeah, construction unions, are they unionized in PEI? Or
They are. They are. And I avoided talking about them only because I did not know enough about them. I came across a file card yesterday where the National Union decertified the construction union on PEI in the 1980s. But I have no idea what the issue was and whether it was a threat or a threat they carried out. But construction is definitely unionized. And they are certified. So yeah. And that's a fairly sizable group of people, but there are a lot of small-scale construction firms. My father was a carpenter, and he never unionized. He didn't have. But if you're one of the larger firms, you are unionized, and yes, no, you don't do this because that's not what your union does, for sure. And there's always a downside to unions as well, but it's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off.
Any other questions?
I was given a candy, by the way, for when I was done. So I get to have the candy as long as we're done. Yes.
Dominic.
Did the teachers get what they're asking for?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. I think the government probably went, sure. But they do better at arbitration. And during the 7.5% wage cut, I forget what exactly happened, but they broke ranks and they did something and settled for 3.5% cut. And I was not happy at the time, but I forgave them.
Teddy?
Yes.
I got two questions that are from the history part you're talking about.
Sure.
And also one for the future. And I don't know, they might be two big questions or way off the mark. So I think chronological order, when you're talking about the fishers,
Yeah.
and having not being able to actually, or they did not work together across the board. So there might have been like pockets or different kind of independent, whether you want to call them unions or associations or federations, but as a whole they didn't work together. So
They have an omnibus organization. Within it, there tends to be a fractious quality where they have trouble speaking with one voice.
Okay.
Not because there are multiple organizations, each speaking with a different voice, simply that within that organization, people don't exercise the solidarity that they need on some occasions. And then there are, of course, issues where very difficult issues, including indigenous access to the fishery, where the membership have a lot of different opinions about it.
Well, the question I have about that was, were there things that were about, were there any kind of material differences that lent themselves to that kind of inability to work together? Like, were fishing conditions or histories of different groups
That it's a really good question. There's a tendency for us to think of everybody on PEI who fished being more or less the same.
Right.
But there were some parts of PEI where people fished as a living for their entire living. They were the ones most likely, and it was especially in the western end of PEI where there was a union established, where they were tended to be exploited more so, and often didn't own their gear, their boat or their gear. They fished for the packer, were paid less for their lobster. So within the fishery, there are different seasons for lobster. There are different fisheries, although lobster is the main one. And that does lead to some differences of opinion.
Okay.
And also the catches are different depending on where you are on Prince Edward Island.
Right.
My father fished in a river on the eastern coast, and his best year he got 18,000 pounds. Well, recently in the North Shore of PEI, they're getting 90,000 pounds a year of lobster. So that makes a difference as well, right?
Yeah.
And also, people turn to unions when there's pain.
Right.
And prolonged pain often leads them away from unions, but pain leads them to unions. So beginning in the early 80s, there was a golden age in the lobster industry and PEI when the catch and the price both went up at the same time. So union sentiment tended to quiet down. Because the going is good. And then people more and more feel like I'm an independent operator. I'm a producer, as opposed to we need to compromise with one another because we need to present a solid front against the fish plant owners or the government. So, but I can't really answer your question because no one has really driven down deep enough to explore the differences from place to place and within the fishery from one individual to another. So that's one question.
Okay, I'll skip to my last question.
I have the whole afternoon. I don't know. You guys have nothing going on, do you?
Well, I was going to say...
It's no good to go to the shore today. So it's right up.
You said there's more of the culture shifting a bit, and there's more of a respect and seeing unions as like pushing back against some of the earlier kind of views. And I was wondering, do you see any specific or particular challenges that unions from an island perspective are facing? It could also be similar ones that other ones are facing, but I'm kind of more interested in that particular lens.
Yeah.
Is there anything to
Well, I think, again, when you're a local of a national union, there's always a balancing act, right? So especially if you're, say, a postal worker. I have a niece that's a postal worker. But that's why the largest growing sector of the island economy is the service sector, which doesn't tend to be organized on PEI. And then the other second largest is the growth in government, so government employees. So any attempt at retrenchment in government, and some economists are talking about, I read a prominent economist about a decade ago, advocating that federal government employees in the Maritime should be paid less. Because right now they make more money than people in the private sector, and so their skill and leadership and talent wasn't being invested in the private sector. So if you lowered their wages, it would drive them into the private sector, and that would be good for the Atlantic economy. Now I'm thinking, you know what that results in? People moving to Alberta and Ottawa and working for the government someplace else. It doesn't drive them into local industries or businesses. But he was attacking the idea of entrepreneurialism and that, we're too passive in the region and our leadership tends to migrate. So out-migration is always a factor when it comes to leadership. In the 1930s, the cooperative movement had a lot of good leaders, in part because they weren't leaving the island to go work someplace else because there was no work anyplace else. So they were stuck at home in the farm and they were ready to provide leadership. But I think our economy is geared to tourism, and tourism has limits to growth. Tourism is an industry that consumes. It consumes a culture, it consumes an environment. And so there are limits to tourism, which is being reached in other parts of the world. So that's an issue, and that may cause labor to organize on PEI in the tourism industry to a degree that it has not. If government retrenches and people get laid off, I think that's going to be a real factor for unions on PEI. If Canada Post closes or is completely reinvented, that's going to affect hundreds of workers on PEI. And when the province is small, those actually are significant numbers. In a way, they're not in Ontario. Donald Trump's actions, the mercurial nature of his actions with respect to tariffs will have a domino effect even on PEI. And it will affect the union movement on PEI. Construction on PEI is booming right now. But construction is linked to people's willingness to invest. Those sorts of external factors will affect the union movement on PEI and labor on PEI more so than internal factors working out. I think external factors working in.
Any more questions? Seeing none? Ed, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
On behalf of CCU, we offer you this gift. And thank you for your
you.
presentation today. It was awesome.
Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.